the sandwich that started WWI. The greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was not triggered by a master plan, but by a traffic error and a lunch break. By the afternoon of June 28, 1914, the plot to kill Archduke Franz Ferdinand had actually failed completely. The team of assassins had lined the river route earlier that morning. One threw a bomb, but it bounced off the Archduke's convertible and exploded under the car behind it. The Archduke was unharmed, the attackers scattered in panic, and the security threat was considered over. One of the failed assassins, Gavrilo Princip, gave up. Defeated and hungry, he wandered away from the main road and stopped at Moritz Schiller's Delicatessen on a quiet side street to buy a sandwich. He stood on the curb, just a random civilian in a crowd, believing history had passed him by. Meanwhile, the Archduke decided to visit the hospital to check on the officers injured by the morning's bomb. However, his staff forgot to inform the drivers about the change in itinerary. The lead car followed the original parade route and blindly made a wrong turn onto Franz Josef Street, the exact street where Princip was eating. When the governor in the passenger seat shouted about the mistake, the driver slammed on the brakes. The car didn't just stop. The gearbox jammed and the engine stalled. The Archduke's open-top limousine sat silent and motionless, 5 feet away from the deli. Princip looked up and saw his target sitting like a statue directly in front of him. He didn't have to hunt the Archduke down. The car had been delivered to him. He dropped his lunch, stepped up to the vehicle, and fired 2 shots. If the car hadn't stalled at that precise second, the world might have avoided the First World War. Instead, a wrong turn turned a failed assassin into the man who broke Europe. The Jim twins. In 1940, 2 identical twin boys were separated at birth and adopted by different working-class families in Ohio. They lived just 40 miles apart, completely unaware of the other's existence. Yet, from the very start, their lives synced up with impossible precision. Both sets of adoptive parents, strangers to one another, independently decided to give their new son the exact same name, James. Jim Lewis was raised in Lima, while Jim Springer grew up in Piqua. Despite the distance, their personal histories mirrored each other down to the finest detail. As children, both boys adopted a stray dog and named it Toy. As they matured into adulthood, they both gravitated toward the same career path, finding work in law enforcement and security. The coincidences in their romantic lives were even more unsettling. Both men met and married women named Linda. Following an identical timeline, they both divorced the Lindas and eventually remarried women named Betty. When they became fathers, the pattern held firm. One named his son James Allen, and the other named his boy James Allen. When they finally reunited at age 39, the similarities were so overwhelming that they became the subject of intense scientific study. Researchers looked for genetic explanations, but DNA cannot explain why 2 strangers would choose the same names for their wives and pets. It appeared less like biology and more like a massive administrative glitch, as if the universe had simply copy-pasted the exact same life story twice. Edgar Allan Poe's Richard Parker. Edgar Allan Poe is remembered as a master of horror, but his most disturbing contribution to literature wasn't a ghost story, it was an accidental prophecy. In 1838, he published a novel about 4 shipwrecked sailors stranded on a damaged vessel. They are starving, dehydrated, and thousands of miles from land. In the climax of the book, the men decide that to survive, they must resort to cannibalism. They draw straws, and the loser is the youngest among them, a cabin boy. the fictional crew kills him and consumes his remains. Poe gave this unfortunate character a specific name: Richard Parker. For decades, this was just a grim scene in a work of fiction. Then, in 1884, the yacht Mignonette sank in the South Atlantic. 4 real crew members escaped into a small dinghy with no provisions. They drifted for weeks, their bodies wasting away. Eventually, the instinct for survival overrode their morality. The 3 older men turned on the youngest member of the crew, a 17-year-old cabin boy who had fallen ill from drinking seawater. They killed him and ate his body to stay alive. When the survivors were finally rescued and brought back to England to face trial, the case became a global sensation. But for those familiar with Poe's work, the trial revealed a detail that made the blood run cold. The real cabin boy, who was killed and eaten by 3 shipwrecked sailors, exactly as described in the novel written 46 years earlier, was named Richard Parker. Poe hadn't just written a scene, he had named the victim of a murder that wouldn't happen for another half-century. Morgan Robertson's Titanic prediction, the blueprints for the Titanic disaster, were on public display in 1898, not in a shipyard, but in the fiction section of a bookstore. 14 years before the real ship was even designed, an author named Morgan Robertson wrote a novella titled Futility that accidentally predicted the 20th century's most famous tragedy with forensic accuracy. He wasn't a psychic. He was just a guy trying to write a thriller about a big boat, but the details he guessed are mathematically terrifying. He named his fictional ship the Titan. He described it as the largest vessel afloat and labeled it unsinkable. He gave it 3 propellers and a length of 800 feet. When the real Titanic was finally built, it had 3 propellers and measured 882 feet. The difference between the fantasy and the reality was less than the length of a tennis court. Robertson needed a way to destroy his creation, so he chose a specific set of circumstances. He wrote that the Titan was speeding at 25 knots through the North Atlantic. He set the date in April. He decided the cause of destruction would be an iceberg strike on the starboard side. When the real Titanic sank, it was steaming at 22 knots in the North Atlantic in April and struck an iceberg on the starboard side. But the most chilling coincidence is the death toll. To make his story tragic, Robertson decided the Titan would carry the legal minimum number of lifeboats, leaving thousands to die in the freezing water. The real Titanic made the exact same administrative error. Robertson didn't just write a story, he pre-wrote the autopsy report. He was accused of clairvoyance for the rest of his life, but he claimed he just knew ships. Either way, he managed to document history before it actually happened. Tamerlane's curse. A heavy slab of black jade is pried loose from the floor of a mausoleum. The air that escapes the crypt hasn't moved in 5 centuries. It smells of dust, resin, and ancient fear. A team of Soviet anthropologists stands over the opening, tasked by Stalin, to exhume the remains of Tamerlane, the warlord who once built pyramids out of human skulls. The locals beg the scientists to stop. They point to the warnings etched into the stone, insisting that this isn't just a grave, but a prison for a dark energy. The inscription on the tomb is specific. It doesn't threaten bad luck or a haunting. It predicts a geopolitical catastrophe, warning that whoever disturbs the warlord's rest will unleash an invader far more terrible than he ever was. The scientists are men of logic, loyal to the state rather than folklore. They brush the superstition aside. They lift the lid, expose the skeleton, and begin their study of the conqueror's broken body. They celebrate the archaeological victory, completely unaware that they have just started a timer. The victory lasts less than 48 hours. 2 days after the tomb is breached, the prophecy manifests in the real world. Adolf Hitler tears up his non-aggression pact and launches Operation Barbarossa. Nazi Germany invades the Soviet Union with the largest military force in human history. The invader, more terrible than Tamerlane, arrives exactly on cue, burning Russian cities to the ground. The coincidence is so rattling that it reaches the Kremlin. Stalin eventually orders the remains to be returned. The skeleton is reburied with full Islamic rites. In a final twist of timing, days after the tomb is sealed shut, the German army is finally stopped at the Battle of Stalingrad, turning the tide of the war. Stanislav Petrov's decision. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov is the officer in charge. He is staring at a report that says the United States has just fired 5 nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union. The protocol is absolute. Petrov is a soldier, not a politician. His job is to verify the signal and pass it up the chain of command. If he makes that call, the Soviet leadership will unleash a full-scale nuclear retaliation before the American warheads even land. World War III begins in minutes, but Petrov hesitates. He looks at the data. The computer insists an attack is underway, but his intuition screams that it is a lie. He reasons that if the Americans were going to start a nuclear war, they wouldn't just fire 5 missiles. They would fire thousands to cripple the Soviet response. A 5-missile attack makes no tactical sense. Against all his training, he decides to trust his gut over the machine. He picks up the phone and reports a system malfunction. Then he waits. He stands in the bunker, checking his watch, waiting to see if he has just doomed his country. Minutes pass. The radar remains silent. There is no flash of light. It turns out the satellites hadn't seen missiles. They had seen the sun reflecting off the tops of high-altitude clouds. The angle of the light matched the heat signature of a rocket engine perfectly. The entire world came within inches of incineration because of a freak alignment of sunlight and water vapor. Civilization survived only because the man on the night shift was stubborn enough to blink. Tsutomu Yamaguchi. The sky above the shipyard doesn't just brighten, it ceases to exist. A sudden, silent flash of magnesium white erases the morning, followed instantly by a shockwave that flattens the city. Tsutomu Yamaguchi is thrown into a ditch, his eardrums ruptured and his skin burned. He climbs out of the debris to find that the world around him has been reduced to ash. He is a naval engineer on a business trip, and he has just survived the first atomic bomb in human history. Most people would stay in a shelter, but Yamaguchi just wants to go home. He drags his injured body to the railway station, stepping over the dead, and manages to board a train leaving the ruins of Hiroshima. He believes he is fleeing away from the nightmare. He travels overnight to his hometown. He hugs his wife, gets his burns treated at a local hospital, and, with incredible resilience, decides to go to work the next morning. The location of his office is Nagasaki. At 11 a.m., Yamaguchi is standing in a meeting room, arguing with his boss. He is trying to explain the unexplainable. He tells his superior that a single bomb destroyed the entire city of Hiroshima. The boss is skeptical, calling him crazy and insisting that no such weapon exists. While the boss is mid-sentence, the room fills with that familiar, blinding white light. The windows shatter. The building shakes violently. For the second time in 3 days, a nuclear weapon detonates over Tsutomu Yamaguchi's head. He is knocked to the floor, his bandages torn off, but he is still breathing. He had traveled to the only 2 places on Earth targeted by atomic weapons at the exact moments they were struck, and he walked away from both. The D-Day crosswords. In the spring of 1944, the Allies were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history. The secrecy surrounding D-Day was absolute. A single leak could alert the Germans and result in a massacre on the beaches. British intelligence monitored phone lines, mail and radio waves, desperate to plug any gaps. But the most dangerous security breach of the war didn't happen in a dark alley or a coded telegram. It appeared publicly in the morning newspaper. Leonard Dorr was a physics teacher and the headmaster of a school in Surrey. In his spare time, he created crossword puzzles for the Daily Telegraph. Throughout May and early June, his puzzles began to feature a bizarrely specific set of answers. First, the word Utah appeared. Then came Omaha. These were the top secret code names for the American landing beaches. British intelligence officers were nervous, but dismissed it as a fluke. Then the coincidences accelerated. The word Overlord, the code name for the entire invasion, appeared in the grid. Days later, the answer to a clue was Neptune, the code for the naval assault. Finally, on June 1st, just days before the attack, the puzzle contained the word Mulberry, the classified name for the artificial harbours being built for the coast of France. MI5 agents raided the school immediately. They were convinced Dorr was a German sleeper agent using the newspaper to signal the enemy. They interrogated him for hours, threatening him with execution for treason. Dorr was terrified and confused. He eventually explained his process. He often asked his students to fill the blank crossword grids with random words before he wrote the clues. It turned out the school was located next to a base full of American and Canadian soldiers. The boys had been hanging out near the camp fences, listening to the soldiers chat. The troops had been casually using the secret code words in conversation. The children, thinking the words sounded interesting, wrote them into the puzzle grid. The most sensitive secrets of World War II were published to millions of readers, simply because a group of schoolboys had good hearing. Lincoln and Kennedy. History is usually taught as a timeline moving forward, but sometimes it feels like a loop. When you look at the presidencies of Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, the timeline doesn't just rhyme, it repeats with mathematical precision. The symmetry begins with the calendar. Abraham Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. John F. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946. Lincoln won the presidency in 1860. Kennedy won the presidency in 1960. Exactly 100 years separated every major step of their political careers. Both men were deeply involved in the struggle for civil rights, and both were assassinated on a Friday in the presence of their wives. The connection even extends to the names involved. Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theatre. Kennedy was shot while riding in a Lincoln limousine made by the Ford Motor Company. The pattern continues with the men who replaced them. Both presidents were succeeded by Southerners named Johnson. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908. Once again, the century gap is exact. But the most disorienting coincidence involves the assassins themselves. John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald were both known by 3 names composed of 15 letters. The geography of their crimes is a perfect inversion. Booth shot Lincoln in a theatre and then ran to a warehouse to hide. Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and then ran to a theatre to hide. And finally, both assassins were killed before they could ever stand trial. The lists of similarities are so long that they stop looking like random chance and start looking like history plagiarizing itself. Violet Jessup, Miss Unsinkable. The White Star Line built 3 gigantic sister ships to dominate the Atlantic: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. Only one person in history was on board all three vessels during their respective disasters and survived every single one. Her name was Violet Jessup, a stewardess who possessed a unique talent for walking away from maritime catastrophes. Her streak began in 1911 on the RMS Olympic. It was the largest ship in the world at the time. While navigating the Solent Strait, it collided violently with the British warship HMS Hawke. The crash tore a massive hole in the hull, nearly capsizing the vessel, but the ship managed to limp back to port. Violet was working on board, unhurt, but shaken. Instead of quitting, she signed a contract for the Olympic's newer, flashier sister, the Titanic. She was in her bunk when the ship hit the iceberg in 1912. She made it onto lifeboat 16, clutching a baby that a stranger had thrust into her arms, and watched the great liner vanish into the freezing dark. 4 years later, during World War I, she volunteered as a nurse on the third sister, the Britannic. The ship had been converted into a floating hospital. While sailing in the Aegean Sea, it struck a deep-sea mine and began to sink rapidly. Violet jumped into the water, but the ship's massive propellers were still turning, creating a vortex that sucked swimmers toward the blades. Violet was pulled under and struck her head hard against the ship's keel, fracturing her skull. Yet, she managed to surface and was hauled to safety. Violet Jessup eventually retired to a quiet cottage in Suffolk, having outlived the entire Olympic class of liners. She died of heart failure at the age of 83, proving that while ice, steel, and explosives could destroy the world's biggest ships, they couldn't stop the woman standing on the deck. The Hugh Williams legend. The Irish Sea is freezing in December. It is 1660, and the water off the coast of Wales is currently grinding a wooden passenger ship into splinters against the rocks. The screaming stops quickly. 80 people are dragged under the whitecaps, their lungs filling with salt water. Amidst the debris, a single hand reaches up and grabs a floating beam. A man hauls himself onto the wood, gasping for air. He is the only person to leave the water alive. His name is Hugh Williams. If it happened once, it would be a miracle. But the ocean seems to have a glitch. More than a century later, in 1767, the same coastline destroys another ship. 127 bodies are lost to the tide. But one man washes up on the sand, alive and terrified. When the locals ask who he is, he says, Hugh Williams. By 1820, the anomaly moves to the Thames. A boat capsizes, drowning every passenger except one. The survivor is, predictably, a man named Hugh Williams. The final act in 1940 feels less like history and more like a writer's room joke. A German mine vaporizes a trawler. Only 2 men survive the explosion. They are unrelated to the previous survivors, but related to each other, an uncle and his nephew. Both answer to the name Hugh Williams. For nearly 300 years, this specific name acted as a bizarre form of armor. It suggests that in the history of British shipwrecks, survival wasn't about swimming ability or luck, but simply having the right signature. King Umberto I and his double. The odds of meeting a stranger who looks exactly like you are nearly non-existent. But King Umberto I of Italy didn't just meet a physical double. He met a man who seemed to be living his exact life on a different timeline. The encounter happened in a small restaurant in Monza, where the owner looked so much like the monarch that they could have swapped places without the royal guards noticing. They shared the same weathered face, the same build, and the exact same handlebar moustache. Intrigued by this living mirror, the king invited the man to his table. As they spoke, the situation shifted from a funny coincidence to a biographical impossibility. The restaurant owner was also named Umberto. They were both born on the exact same day, March 14th, 1844, in the same town. The king asked about his wife. The owner replied that he was married to a woman named Margarita. The queen's name was also Margarita. Even their careers were synced. The owner had opened his restaurant on the precise date that the king had been crowned. The king was deeply moved by this cosmic connection and planned to honor his twin the following day. However, the universe insisted on one final, dark parallel. The next morning, the king was informed that the restaurant owner had died after being shot in an unexplained accident. The news left the king visibly shaken. He climbed into his carriage to leave the city, perhaps sensing the pattern wasn't finished. Moments later, an anarchist assassin emerged from the crowd and fired 4 shots. The king died instantly. The two Umbertos had been born on the same day, lived mirrored lives and were extinguished by bullets on the same afternoon. Joseph Figlock's baby catch. The pavement is hard and the alleyway is narrow. Joseph Figlock is walking his usual route, his eyes fixed on the ground ahead of him. He has no reason to look up. He is simply a pedestrian in the wrong place at the right time. Without warning, a heavy weight strikes his shoulders and knocks him to the concrete. He hasn't been mugged or hit by a car. He has been hit by a baby. A small child had fallen from a 4th-story window directly above him. Figlock's body acted as a human cushion, breaking the infant's fall. Both of them are bruised and shaken, but they are alive. It is a miraculous 1-in-a-million event. Normally, this is where the story ends. But the universe has a strange sense of repetition. Exactly 1 year later, Figlock is walking down the same street. He passes under the same building. He is likely not thinking about the previous year's collision, but gravity is. For the second time, the same baby tumbles out of the same window. The child falls 4 stories. Once again, Joseph Figlock is standing in the exact geometric center of the landing zone. The baby hits him again. For the second time, Figlock absorbs the impact. For the second time, both the man and the baby survive. Figlock wasn't a guardian angel, he was just a statistical anomaly. He became an unwitting safety net for a careless family, catching the same life twice, simply because he refused to change his walking route. The taxi driver brothers. The engine of the moped hums as it weaves through the narrow streets. The rider is a 17-year-old boy named Neville, enjoying a ride in the Bermuda sun. He turns a corner and a taxi fills his vision. The impact is sudden and fatal. Neville dies at the scene, leaving his family devastated and his moped twisted in the road. The bike, however, is salvaged. Exactly 1 year later, Neville's brother, Erskine, turns 17. He decides to take the family moped out for a spin. The bike has been repaired, the scratches painted over. Erskine drives down the same street where his brother died. It seems impossible, but the universe hits the replay button. A taxi collides with the moped. Erskine is thrown from the bike and killed instantly. 2 brothers, both 17, killed on the same bike, on the same street, exactly 1 year apart. But the police report turns this tragedy into a statistical miracle. When the investigators arrive, they realize the taxi involved in the crash is driven by the same man who hit Neville the year before. He is driving the exact same car. Then comes the final impossible detail. The passenger in the back seat of the taxi is the same man who was riding in it 1 year ago. He had hired the same driver for a trip, only to witness the death of the second brother from the same window. The odds of these elements aligning, the date, the bike, the driver, and the passenger, are so low that it feels less like a coincidence and more like a glitch in the simulation. Lincoln and Booth. The crowd at the Jersey City train station is pushing too hard. A young man is pinned against a sleeping train car, waiting to buy a ticket. Suddenly the train jerks into motion. The movement knocks him off his feet, and he slips into the narrow, dangerous gap between the platform and the grinding steel wheels. He is seconds away from being crushed. A hand reaches out from the crowd. It grabs the young man by the collar of his coat and hauls him back up to safety just as the train gains speed. The young man stands up, shakes the dust off his coat, and recognizes his rescuer immediately. The man who pulled him from the tracks is Edwin Booth. At this moment in history, Edwin is the most famous actor in America, a celebrity known across the Union. The young man he saved is Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest son of President Abraham Lincoln. The two men exchange pleasantries. Robert is grateful to be alive. Edwin is simply glad to have helped, unaware that he just saved the president's son. This random act of kindness eventually curdles into the strangest irony in American history. A few years later, Edwin's younger, erratic brother, John Wilkes Booth, walks into a theater box in Washington, D.C. and assassinates Robert's father. The history books usually focus on the murder, but the full picture is far more complex. The Booth family destroyed the Lincoln family, yet they also preserved it. One brother took a life in a theater, while the other saved a life on a train platform. The universe balanced the ledger in a twisted exchange. The assassin killed the father, but the actor had already ensured the son would survive. Bench in the Leicester Square Underground station. Commuters rush past it, ignoring the litter. To the thousands of people on the platform, it is trash. But to the frustrated man walking toward the train, it looks like a hallucination. The man is Anthony Hopkins. He has just spent the entire day scouring the bookstores of London for a novel titled The Girl from Petrovka. He has been cast in the film adaptation and wants to study the source material, but every shop is sold out. He is about to give up when he looks down at the bench. The abandoned book is not just any novel, it is a copy of The Girl from Petrovka. Hopkins picks it up, stunned by his luck. He notices the book is heavily used, with handwritten notes scribbled in the margins. He takes it home, assuming a previous student had discarded it. Months later, the story moves from lucky to impossible. Hopkins is on set, chatting with the book's author, George Pfeiffer. Pfeiffer is venting his frustration. He explains that he doesn't have a copy of his own book to reference. He tells Hopkins that he lent his personal copy, the one containing all his original annotations and character breakdowns, to a friend who lost it somewhere in London. Hopkins stops him. He goes to his trailer and retrieves the beat-up paperback he found in the subway. He hands it to Pfeiffer. It is the exact same book. In a city of 8 million people, the author's lost personal copy had travelled across London to wait on a specific bench for the one actor who needed it to perform the role. Jefferson and Adams. The church bells are ringing across the United States, signalling the start of the massive Jubilee celebration. It is a day of parades, speeches, and cannon fire. But inside a quiet bedroom at Monticello, the festivities are muffled by heavy curtains. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the nation's birth certificate, is fading. He is 83 years old, and he is fighting to hold on, drifting in and out of consciousness. 500 miles to the north in Massachusetts, another room is silent. John Adams, the firebrand who pushed the colonies to break from Britain, is also on his deathbed. He is 90. His heart is failing. These two men defined the American era. They had worked side by side to draft the Declaration of Independence, They had served as presidents. Over the decades, their relationship had swung violently from close friendship to bitter political hatred, finally settling into a warm, letter-writing reconciliation in their final years. They were the last surviving architects of the revolution. Now, the universe decides to close their chapter with a symmetry that defies logic. The date is July 4th, 1826. It is exactly 50 years to the day since they signed the Declaration. Jefferson dies in the early afternoon, passing away while the country outside toasts his name. Adams lingers for a few more hours. As the sun sets on the 50th anniversary, he whispers his final comfort. He dies believing that the country is safe because Thomas Jefferson still survives. He is wrong. He doesn't know that his friend had died just 5 hours earlier. The two founding fathers who built the country together and fought for its soul did not just share a legacy, they shared a death date. They exited the stage on the exact same day, exactly half a century after they created the nation, signing off on history together one last time. Mark Twain's Comet. In November 1835, as the comet lights up the night sky, a baby boy is born. His name is Samuel Clemens, though the world will later know him as Mark Twain. Twain lives a life that defines American literature. He travels the world, writes masterpieces, and becomes a global celebrity. But he never shakes the feeling that his existence is tethered to that celestial visitor. He believes his life is not running on human time, but on the comet's schedule. As an old man, living in a sprawling house in Connecticut, Twain makes a bizarre prediction. He tells his friends that he and the comet are a pair of unaccountable freaks. Since they arrived together, he insists they must leave together. He is so sure of this cosmic itinerary that he claims it would be the greatest disappointment of his life if he didn't die when the comet returned. The universe decides to honor the request. 76 years after his birth, the sky changes. It is April 1910. Halley's Comet swings back around the sun, visible to the naked eye, frightening the superstitious and mesmerizing the scientists. As the comet blazes overhead, reaching its brightest point, Mark Twain's heart finally gives out. He dies one day after the comet's closest approach. He arrived with the visitor, stayed for exactly one orbit, and caught the return trip out, fulfilling his own prophecy with perfect astronomical timing. Enzo Ferrari and Mesut Özil, the dark sunglasses hide the eyes of a giant. Enzo Ferrari is 90 years old, the emperor of the automotive world, a man whose name is synonymous with speed, luxury, and the color red. In August 1988, the Commendatore finally succumbs to old age in Maranello, Italy. The racing world mourns the loss of its patriarch, believing that a singular face has vanished from history forever. But the universe apparently recycles. Just 2 months after Ferrari is buried, a baby boy is born in the industrial city of Gelsenkirchen, Germany. His parents name him Mesut Özil. He grows up to be a virtuoso on the football pitch, a playmaker known for his vision and precision. But as his fame grows, fans start to notice something unsettling about his face. When you place a black and white photograph of a young Enzo Ferrari next to a modern photo of Mesut Özil, the result is not just a resemblance, it looks like the same negative printed twice. The facial geometry is identical. They share the same heavy-lidded eyes, the same nose structure, and the exact same mouth. The timeline makes the visual match even stranger. The window between the car maker's death and the footballer's birth is so narrow that it fuels endless internet theories about reincarnation. It looks less like genetics and more like a transfer of consciousness. One man built the machines that raced across the asphalt. The other became a machine that raced across the grass. They lived in different eras and spoke different languages, yet they wore the exact same face, as if the mold was never broken, just put back in storage for 8 weeks before being used again. Wilmer McLean's War. Wilmer McLean holds the bizarre title of being the landlord for the entire American Civil War. He didn't fight in it, and he certainly didn't ask for it, but the conflict chased him across Virginia with magnetic precision. In 1861, McLean was living a quiet life near a stream called Bull Run. He wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble found him. The first major battle of the war exploded right on his property. A Union artillery shell literally tore through his summer kitchen, destroying his family's lunch. McLean realized his farmhouse was now a battlefield, and he decided to get as far away from the violence as possible. He packed up his family and moved 150 miles south to a tiny, obscure village called Appomattox Courthouse. He chose it specifically because it was a dust-speck town with no strategic value. He assumed he had outsmarted the war. He was wrong. For 4 years, the armies marched all over the country, but in the final days of the conflict, fate circled back to McLean. In April 1865, General Robert E. Lee needed a place to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant. His aide looked for a suitable home, and out of all the houses in Virginia, he picked Wilmer McLean's new residence. McLean was forced to host the surrender. The Union and Confederate generals sat in his living room to sign the peace treaty. The war had begun with a cannonball in his kitchen and ended with a handshake in his parlor. He had moved hours away to escape the fighting, only to have the two armies use his house as the bookends for the bloodiest chapter in American history. The man who didn't shoot. In 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain sat in Adolf Hitler's private study in the Bavarian Alps. While the world worried about impending war, Hitler wanted to talk about art. He pointed to a reproduction of a famous painting hanging on his wall. It depicted a British soldier carrying a wounded comrade on a battlefield. Hitler told the confused Prime Minister that the man in the painting was the soldier who had spared his life. The soldier in the image was Henry Tanday, the most decorated British private of the First World War. 20 years earlier, near the French village of Marcoing, the British had overrun the German lines. During the chaos, a wounded German soldier stumbled into Tanday's line of fire. The enemy was limping, unarmed, and clearly defeated. Tanday was a trained killer, but he was not a butcher. He looked through his sights and made a split-second moral choice. He couldn't shoot a defenseless man. He lowered his rifle and signaled for the German to go. The soldier nodded in thanks and disappeared into the safety of the mist. That soldier was a young corporal named Adolf Hitler. When Chamberlain returned to Britain, he contacted Tanday to pass along the German Chancellor's gratitude. For Tanday, this wasn't a celebrity encounter, it was a psychological nightmare. He realized that his single act of mercy had accidentally authorized the Second World War. As the years passed and the Blitz destroyed British cities, Tanday was forced to watch the man he saved burn the world down. He spent the rest of his life haunted by the knowledge that he had the solution in his rifle sights, but he chose to be kind instead. Andrew Jackson's misfires. Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter, waited in the Capitol Rotunda with a clear plan. He was armed with 2 brass single-shot pistols. He knew that early 19th century firearms could be unreliable, so he brought a backup to ensure the job was finished. As Jackson exited a funeral service, Lawrence stepped out from behind a pillar, leveled his first weapon at the president's heart from barely 6 feet away, and pulled the trigger. The percussion cap detonated with a loud noise, but the gunpowder failed to ignite. The gun simply clicked. Jackson didn't retreat. He raised his cane and charged his attacker. Lawrence, realizing his first plan had failed, drew his second pistol. He aimed point blank at the rushing president and fired again. For the second time in seconds, the mechanism clicked. The cap popped, but the weapon did not discharge. The crowd tackled Lawrence while Jackson had to be physically restrained from beating the assassin with his walking stick. The true mystery emerged during the investigation. The police seized Lawrence's weapons and tested them. They found both pistols to be in perfect working order. When test fired, they discharged on the first try every single time. Experts concluded that the damp winter air in Washington that day had likely moistened the powder just enough to prevent ignition. The odds of two well-maintained pistols misfiring back-to-back were calculated at 1 in 125,000. The only thing that stood between Andrew Jackson and death was the weather. Stephen Hawking's death. Stephen Hawking spent 50 years traveling through the universe in his mind, obsessed with the nature of time. He wrote books about how time bends, how it begins, and how it might end. He searched for a theory of everything, a single mathematical framework to explain the cosmos. While he never pinned down that final equation, the timeline of his own life formed a pattern so perfect, it feels engineered by the stars themselves. His story begins on January 8th, 1942. To the average person, this was just a day during the Second World War. But in the history of science, it was a precise anniversary. Exactly 300 years earlier, to the day, Galileo Galilei died. Galileo was the father of modern astronomy, the man who first proved the Earth revolved around the sun. Hawking arrived precisely 3 centuries later to pick up the torch. Hawking defied a medical diagnosis that gave him 2 years to live and continued his work for decades. When he finally passed away, the calendar synchronized again. He died on March 14th, 2018. March 14th is already special to scientists as Pi Day, because 3.14 represents the famous mathematical constant. But more importantly, it is the birthday of Albert Einstein. The 3 men who defined our understanding of gravity, Galileo, Einstein, and Hawking, are linked by a continuous chain of dates. Hawking was born on the death anniversary of the first master, and he died on the birth anniversary of the second. His life served as a perfect bridge between the father of science and the father of relativity. It was the kind of elegant, circular symmetry that Hawking loved in his physics, suggesting that time itself gave a final nod to the man who spent his life studying it. Clouds over Kokura. The crosshairs of history were locked tight on the city of Kokura. It was the morning of August 9th, 1945, and a B-29 bomber named Boxcar was cruising at high altitude with the second atomic bomb in its bay. The mission plan was explicit. Kokura was a massive military arsenal and the primary target for destruction. The city of Nagasaki was merely a backup plan, a secondary option written in the margins of the flight logs. The American orders contained one crucial constraint. The crew had to visually identify the target before releasing the weapon. They were forbidden from dropping the bomb using only radar. As the plane approached Kokura, the crew expected clear skies. Instead, they found a wall of white. Smoke from a firebombing raid on a neighboring city had drifted in overnight, mixing with the morning clouds to hide Kokura completely. The bomber made 3 separate passes, circling the city for 45 minutes. On the ground, hundreds of thousands of people walked to work, completely unaware that the most destructive weapon on Earth was circling directly above them, waiting for a single gap in the fog. The gap never opened. With fuel running critically low and anti-aircraft fire beginning to track them, the pilot finally gave up. He turned the plane south toward the secondary target. When they arrived over Nagasaki, the clouds broke just enough to allow visual confirmation. The bomb was released and the city was devastated. The difference between life and annihilation for two entire populations came down to a drifting cloud bank. Kokura remained untouched, saved by bad weather. In Japan, the phrase Kokura luck is still remembered today, describing the terrifying reality that sometimes survival isn't about who you are, but simply about which way the wind is blowing. Alexander Fleming's open window, the greatest medical breakthrough of the 20th century, didn't happen because of a complex experiment or a well-funded research grant. It happened because a scientist was terrible at doing the dishes. In 1928, Alexander Fleming's laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London was a disaster zone. Petri dishes filled with deadly Staphylococcus bacteria were stacked in unstable piles, ignored and uncovered. Fleming decided he needed a break, so he left for a 2-week vacation in Scotland. In a disciplined lab, he would have sterilized his equipment and stored his samples before walking out the door. Instead, he simply left the mess on his desk. This act of laziness cleared the way for a miracle. During his absence, a window in the lab was left slightly ajar. This seems like a minor detail, but it changed the course of human history. Outside, the cool London air carried a microscopic intruder. A spore of a common mold called penicillium floated on the breeze. It drifted through the opening and landed on one specific culture dish near the edge of the bench. It was a 1 in a billion shot. If the spore had landed on the floor or the desk, nothing would have happened. Instead, it found a perfect breeding ground. While Fleming relaxed on holiday, the mold grew. It began to secrete a mold juice that did something impossible. It dissolved the deadly bacteria surrounding it. When Fleming returned, he started tossing the old dishes into a cleaning solution. He picked up the contaminated dish, stopped, and noticed a clear halo where the bacteria had been wiped out. That accidental halo was the discovery of penicillin. If the window had been closed, or if Fleming had been slightly tidier, the mold would never have landed. World War II soldiers would have continued to die from simple scratches, and modern surgery would be impossible. The entire foundation of modern medicine rests on a single moment when a messy scientist forgot to close a window. Handel and Hendrix. London is a city of layers where the past and present are constantly stacked on top of each other. But on a quiet road in Mayfair called Brook Street, the timeline of music history didn't just overlap, it collided. In 1723, George Frederick Handel moved into a terraced house at 25 Brook Street. He was the superstar of his era, a man who wrote music for royalty. Inside these walls, he composed his masterpiece, Messiah, and the anthem that is still used for British coronations today. He lived there for nearly 40 years, leaving a legacy of Baroque genius seeped into the floorboards. 2 centuries later, in 1968, a young American musician was looking for a permanent place to stay in London. He found an upstairs flat right next door at 23 Brook Street. That musician was Jimi Hendrix. The coincidence is staggering. 2 of the most influential innovators in music history, one the master of the harpsichord and the orchestra, the other the god of the electric guitar, chose to live on the exact same plot of land. They were separated by 200 years of time, but geographically, they were separated by a single layer of brick. If Hendrix had drilled a hole in his wall to hang a guitar, he would have drilled right into Handel's bedroom. Hendrix wasn't oblivious to his spectral neighbor. He learned about Handel's history and went out to buy records of the composer's work to play in the flat. He often told guests he could feel a vibe in the place, convinced that the musical energy of the street was guiding his fingers. Today, the wall between the two homes has been knocked through to create a single museum, proving that, while musical styles change, the address of genius apparently stays the same. James Dean's Little Bastard. James Dean is remembered as the ultimate symbol of rebellion, but his death wasn't just a high-speed tragedy. It was the opening act of a ghost story. The car he died in, a silver Porsche 550. Spider, he nicknamed Little Bastard, seemed to possess a malevolent will of its own. The trouble started before the engine even turned over. A week before the crash, fellow actor Alec Guinness saw the new car outside a restaurant. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He warned Dean that the car looked sinister and predicted that if he got in it, he would be dead within 7 days. Exactly 7 days later, Dean collided with a Ford Tudor at an intersection and died instantly. Normally, a wrecked car is scrapped, but this wreckage refused to die. The remains of the Porsche were bought by a custom car designer named George Barris. As his team was unloading the twisted metal from the truck, the car slipped off its trailer and crushed a mechanic's leg. Barris decided to part the car out. He sold the engine to a doctor who raced cars on weekends, and the transmission to another driver. The two men entered the same race at the Pomona Fairgrounds, both using parts from the death car. During the race, the doctor's car lost control and hit a tree, killing him instantly. The other driver flipped his car and was critically injured. The Little Bastard had managed to harm 2 people at the same time in 2 different vehicles. The curse continued. The chassis was repaired and sent on a highway safety tour. While stored in a garage in Fresno, the building caught fire and burned to the ground. Every car inside was incinerated, except for the Porsche, which sat amidst the ashes, scorched but intact. The story ends with a disappearing act. In 1960, after causing several more accidents during transport, the car was loaded into a sealed boxcar to be shipped to Los Angeles. When the train arrived and the seal was broken, the container was empty. The car had vanished into thin air, leaving behind a legacy of destruction and a mystery that has never been solved. Walter Summerford. The odds of being struck by lightning in an 80-year lifespan are roughly 1 in 15,000. To be struck 3 times, the odds jump to 1 in a number so large it barely makes sense to calculate it. Yet, for a British major named Walter Summerford, lightning wasn't a rare weather phenomenon. It was a predator. His relationship with the storm began in the mud of World War I. In 1918, Summerford was a cavalry officer riding through the fields of Belgium. A flash of light knocked him from his saddle. He hadn't been hit by enemy artillery, but by a bolt from the sky. The strike paralyzed him from the waist down, ending his military career. He was sent to Vancouver, Canada, to live out his days in peace. He managed to recover his mobility and started a new routine involving quiet days by the river. In 1924, 6 years after the first incident, he was fishing under a large tree. A storm rolled in without warning. Lightning struck the tree and surged into Summerford, instantly paralyzing the entire right side of his body. Against all medical expectations, he learned to walk again. But the sky wasn't finished. In 1930, during a slow stroll through a local park, the 3rd bolt found him. This strike was the final blow, leaving him permanently paralyzed. He died 2 years later, finally safe from the clouds. 4 years after his funeral, a thunderstorm raged over Mountain View Cemetery in Vancouver. A single bolt of lightning arced down from the darkness. It bypassed the tall trees and the nearby buildings. It struck one specific plot of earth, cracking the stone marker directly in half. Even after he was 6 feet underground, the lightning managed to find Walter Summerford one last time. The Mongol typhoons, kamikaze. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire had conquered nearly everything in its path. Under Kublai Khan, they had swallowed China and Korea, creating the largest contiguous land empire in history. The next target on the map was Japan. It should have been a simple annexation, a quick military exercise for the world's most powerful army. Instead, it became a lesson in meteorological probability. In 1274, the first Mongol fleet arrived in Hakata Bay. The samurai were brave, but they were outmatched by the Mongols' poisoned arrows and gunpowder bombs. By nightfall, the Japanese defenders were exhausted and expecting to be overrun the next day. But that night, the wind changed. A massive typhoon struck the bay, smashing the Mongol ships against the rocks and drowning a third of their forces. The invaders were forced to retreat. Japan had been saved by the weather. Kublai Khan did not like losing. He spent the next 7 years building a retaliation force. In 1281, he launched the second invasion. This wasn't just a fleet. It was a floating city. With 4,000 ships and 140,000 men, it was the largest naval invasion force the world would see until World War II. The Japanese built a stone wall along the coast and fought desperately for weeks, but they were just delaying the inevitable. The Mongol numbers were overwhelming. The emperor prayed at the shrines, asking for a miracle. Miraculously, the atmosphere answered. As the Mongols prepared for their final, crushing assault, the sky turned black. A second typhoon, even more powerful than the first, slammed directly into the fleet. The storm destroyed the armada completely, wiping out the invasion force in a single night. To have one invasion stopped by a freak storm is lucky. To have two separate invasions, 7 years apart, both destroyed by massive typhoons at the exact moment of critical danger, felt like divine intervention. The Japanese named these storms kamikaze, or divine wind. The Mongols, who had defeated every army on Earth, finally gave up, beaten not by soldiers, but by a weather pattern that refused to let them land. Dennis the Menace. In Carmel, California, a cartoonist named Hank Ketchum was trying to work. His 4-year-old son, Dennis, was refusing to nap and had just completely trashed his bedroom. Ketchum's wife looked at the wreckage and shouted that the boy was a menace. The phrase stuck. Ketchum immediately sketched a character based on his son, a cute but destructive blonde boy in overalls. He pitched it to newspapers, and they loved it. 4,000 miles away, in a studio in Scotland, another artist named David Law was working on a strip for the B&O. He wasn't thinking about cute toddlers. He was designing a tough, scruffy kid with messy black hair and a red and black striped jersey. He wanted a character who was a genuine terror to his neighborhood. He needed a name that rolled off the tongue. He chose Dennis the Menace. This could be dismissed as common inspiration, except for the calendar. Hank Ketchum's Dennis the Menace was published in American newspapers for the first time on March 12, 1951. David Law's Dennis the Menace hit the newsstands in the United Kingdom on March 12, 1951. There was no internet, no email, and no spy network between the two artists. Yet they both released a comic strip with the exact same title, starring a mischievous boy, on the exact same morning. The coincidence was so perfect that neither side could sue the other for copyright infringement. They simply agreed to a truce, allowing both Dennises to keep terrorizing their respective sides of the Atlantic, forever linked by the strangest shared birthday in publishing history. First and last soldiers of World War I. The First World War claimed nearly 10 million soldiers. With that many bodies to bury, the logistics were chaotic. Men were often interred where they fell, or in hastily expanded plots near the front lines. There was no master plan to organize the graves by history or significance. It was simply a matter of finding space in the mud. In August 1914, a teenager named John Parr lied about his age to join the army. He was a reconnaissance cyclist, scouting ahead of the main force near Mons, Belgium. He ran into German gunfire and became the very first British soldier killed in action during the conflict. 4 years of grinding trench warfare followed. The lines moved back and forth, chewing up a generation. By November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. The guns were set to fall silent at 11 a.m. Minutes before that deadline, a private named George Ellison was on patrol. He was a veteran who had somehow survived every major battle, from the gas attacks to the trenches. At 9:30 a.m., just 90 minutes before peace, a sniper shot him. He became the last British soldier to die in the war. Both men died in the same region, but they were separated by 4 years of hell. After the war, the burial crews went to work at the Saint-Symphorien military cemetery. They filled the plot sequentially, focused on efficiency, not symbolism. Years later, historians looked at the registry and noticed something impossible. By pure random chance, the grave of the first soldier, John Parr, and the grave of the last soldier, George Ellison, are located in the same small cemetery. Even stranger, they are buried just 7 yards apart, their headstones facing each other. The war's beginning and its end stare at one another across a narrow patch of grass, bookending the conflict in a way that no monument ever could. Lee Harvey Oswald's job. In October 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald was not a mastermind surveying the city for a sniper's nest. He was simply a drifter with a pregnant wife, a thin resume, and an empty bank account. He wasn't plotting a murder. He was looking for a paycheck. His destiny was determined by a casual chat between two neighbors. Oswald's landlady was drinking coffee with a friend and mentioned that her tenant was struggling to find work. The friend mentioned that her younger brother worked at a warehouse downtown that happened to be short-handed. It was a mundane tip about a minimum wage gig. Oswald followed the lead. He interviewed and was hired as a temporary order filler at the Texas School Book Depository. He spent his days on the 6th floor, stacking cartons of textbooks for $1.25 an hour. At that moment, President Kennedy's visit to Dallas was still in the early planning stages. There was no finalized itinerary and absolutely no parade route. Oswald had planted himself in that building blindly, with no knowledge that the president would ever be nearby. Weeks later, the Secret Service sat down to map the motorcade. To get the president from the airport to the luncheon at the Trade Mart, the cars needed to access the freeway. The unique layout of Dealey Plaza forced the planners to include a sharp, awkward turn from Houston Street onto Elm Street. That navigational necessity changed the world. The sharp turn forced the presidential limousine to slow down to a crawl directly beneath the specific window where Oswald had been assigned to work. If the neighbor had suggested a job at a grocery store, or if the traffic planners had chosen a different on-ramp, the motorcade would have sped past safely. The assassination required a traffic map to align perfectly with a random help-wanted tip. Discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century began with a lazy throw. In late 1946 or early 1947, a Bedouin teenager named Muhammad Edib was wandering the steep limestone cliffs of the Judean desert. He wasn't searching for treasure, he was searching for a stray goat that had wandered away from the herd. He spotted a small, dark opening in the rock face. Instead of climbing into the dangerous crevice immediately, he picked up a stone and tossed it into the darkness, hoping to startle the animal into coming out. He didn't hear the bleat of a goat. He heard the distinct crunch of shattering pottery. That specific sound changed history. If the rock had hit the limestone wall, the dirt floor, or even the space between the objects, Muhammad would have likely walked away, assuming the cave was empty. But the stone managed to thread the needle and strike a clay jar hidden in the shadows. Muhammad squeezed into the cave and found a collection of tall jars. Inside, wrapped in rotting linen, were leather scrolls. He and his companions had no concept of what they were holding. They carried the bundles back to their camp, even considering using the ancient leather to make sandal straps. Ball of gas, 400 times wider than the moon. If you place them side by side, the moon would look like a grain of sand next to a beach ball. The magic trick relies entirely on distance. The sun happens to be exactly 400 times farther away from Earth than the moon is. This creates a geometric miracle unique to our planet. Because the sun is 400 times larger, but also 400 times more distant, the massive size and the massive distance cancel each other out completely. To the human eye, they appear to be identical in size. However, this is just a temporary accident. The moon is slowly drifting away from Earth at about the speed fingernails grow. Millions of years ago, the moon was too close and covered too much. In the distant future, it will be too far away to cover the sun at all. Humanity just happened to evolve during the brief, lucky window of time where the math lines up perfectly, giving us the best seat in the galaxy for the greatest light show in the solar system. Washington's coat. Long before he was the stoic face on the dollar bill, George Washington was a 23-year-old colonel trying to survive a massacre. In July 1755, during the French and Indian War, the British Army marched directly into an ambush near modern-day Pittsburgh. It was a slaughter. French and Native American forces fired from the cover of the woods, decimating the exposed British column. The enemy marksmen had a specific strategy: target the officers. They knew that if the leaders fell, the troops would break. Within hours, the plan had worked perfectly. Nearly every mounted officer was dead or bleeding out in the mud. General Braddock was shot from his saddle. The command structure had collapsed. Washington was the only officer left on horseback. He spent the battle riding furiously between the panicked lines, trying to organize a retreat. He was a massive target, tall, conspicuous, and constantly moving through the kill zone. By all accounts, he should have been the first to die. When the smoke finally cleared and the survivors limped away, Washington took stock of his condition. He was physically exhausted, but felt no pain. He took off his blue coat to inspect it. The heavy wool was riddled with holes. 4 separate musket balls had punched through the fabric, passing within fractions of an inch of his chest and ribs. Yet, not a single bullet had grazed his skin. During the fighting, 2 different horses had been shot out from under him, collapsing dead while he was still in the saddle. He had simply stood up, dusted himself off, found a new mount, and kept riding. Years later, a Native American chief who fought in the battle claimed his braves had targeted Washington specifically, but eventually stopped firing because they believed the young warrior was protected by a powerful spirit. The man who would found a nation began his legend by wearing a coat that caught the bullets but let the man inside walk away. Teddy Roosevelt's speech. In 1912, Theodore Roosevelt was running for a 3rd term as president, campaigning on the toughness of his Bull Moose Party. In Milwaukee, that toughness ceased to be a slogan and became a matter of ballistics. As Roosevelt left his hotel to head to the auditorium, an unemployed saloon keeper named John Schrank pushed through the crowd. He raised a .38 caliber revolver and fired a single shot directly into Roosevelt's chest from just 5 feet away. A shot from that distance with that caliber is usually fatal. Roosevelt staggered back but did not fall. The crowd surged to lynch the shooter, but Roosevelt calmed them down. Instead of rushing to a hospital, he demanded to be driven to the venue. He was an experienced hunter and soldier. He coughed into his hand, saw no blood, and concluded that the bullet hadn't punctured his lung. The miracle was discovered later. The bullet had indeed struck him squarely in the chest, but before it reached his skin, it had to fight its way through the contents of his breast pocket. Roosevelt was carrying a steel case for his reading glasses and a 50-page manuscript of his speech. Because the speech was folded in half to fit in the pocket, the bullet had to bore through the metal tin and then penetrate 100 layers of heavy paper. This improvised armor slowed the projectile down just enough that it lodged in his chest muscle rather than piercing his heart. He walked onto the stage, unbuttoned his vest to show the stunned audience his blood-soaked shirt, and proceeded to deliver a 90-minute address. He remains the only man in history to survive an assassination attempt simply because he had written a very long speech. Made of the mist miracle. Niagara Falls is a natural machine designed to crush anything that goes over its edge. For centuries, daredevils built reinforced barrels and steel capsules to survive the drop, and many of them still died. But on a July afternoon in 1960, a 7-year-old boy named Roger Woodward took the plunge wearing nothing but a pair of swimming trunks and a cheap life jacket. The nightmare began with a simple engine failure. Roger was on a small aluminum fishing boat with his sister and a family friend. When the motor died, the aggressive current of the upper Niagara River grabbed the hull and flipped it. Roger was swept away into the rapids. He was dragged helplessly toward the Horseshoe Falls, a 160-foot drop into a violent cauldron of white water and rock. He went over the brink. By all laws of physics, the impact should have killed him instantly. If the fall didn't, the massive weight of the water at the bottom should have held him down. But miraculously, Roger popped to the surface, bobbing like a cork in the violent foam. This is where the coincidence saved his life. The bottom of the falls is a chaotic, deafening zone that is almost impossible to access quickly. However, at that exact second, the Maid of the Mist was navigating the basin. The boat was filled with tourists in raincoats expecting a scenic view. Instead, they saw a child floating in the churning water. The captain spotted the bright orange life vest immediately. The crew threw a life preserver and hauled the boy from the water before the current could drag him under. If the tour schedule had been off by just 5 minutes, or if the boat had been turning away, Roger would have vanished. He remains the youngest person to survive the drop unprotected, saved not by skill, but by the punctuality of the local tourism industry. Vasily Arkhipov. Inside the sub, the crew is cut off from the world. They haven't heard from Moscow in days. As the explosions rock the hull, the captain becomes convinced that the Cold War has turned hot. He believes World War III has already started up there, and he decides to go down fighting. He orders the crew to arm the special weapon. This wasn't a standard torpedo. It was a nuclear warhead with the power of the Hiroshima bomb. The target was the American aircraft carrier fleet floating right above their heads. To launch the weapon, the Soviet protocol required unanimous consent from the 3 most senior officers on board. The captain screamed for the launch. The ship's political officer agreed. They just needed one more yes. By pure chance, the submarine B-59 was carrying an extra passenger that day. Vasily Arkhipov was the commodore of the entire submarine flotilla. He could have chosen to ride on any of the 4 submarines in the group, but he happened to be on this one. While the other 2 officers were ready to initiate a nuclear holocaust, Arkhipov stood his ground. He remained calm, arguing that the explosions were just signals, not attacks. Because he was the senior officer present, his veto power was absolute. He blocked the launch and convinced the captain to surface the boat peacefully. The 3 men held the fate of civilization in a small metal room. 2 of them voted to destroy the world. The 3rd man, who wasn't even supposed to be part of the regular crew, voted to save it. We are all here today because Vasily Arkhipov picked the right boat. Roy Sullivan. In the high mountains of Virginia, the clouds didn't just rain on Roy Sullivan, they aimed at him. The odds of an average person being struck by lightning are astronomical. The odds of being struck 7 distinct times defy mathematics entirely. Yet, for Roy Sullivan, a park ranger in Shenandoah National Park, becoming a human lightning rod was just an occupational hazard. His streak began in 1942. He was in a fire lookout tower when a bolt blew his toenail off. That could have been a freak accident, but nature was just getting started. Over the next 35 years, the storms tracked him with bizarre precision. He was hit driving his truck. He was hit standing in his front yard. He was hit while patrolling the park. The lightning burned his eyebrows, seared his shoulder, and set his hair on fire so many times that he eventually started carrying a bucket of water in his car just to put his own head out. The relentless attacks turned his life into a lonely existence. Other rangers refused to walk with him, fearing the sky would open up. Sullivan became a pariah, isolated by his own impossible luck. On one particularly bad day, he was struck by lightning, and immediately after standing up, he had to fight off a black bear that was trying to steal the trout from his fishing line. Sullivan survived all 7 strikes, earning a place in the Guinness Book of World Records that is unlikely to ever be broken. He proved that while lightning is supposed to be random, for him, it felt personal. He remains the only man in history to survive a decades-long duel with the atmosphere itself. Jean-Michel Basquiat's Guernica. To the casual observer, Jean-Michel Basquiat's art looks like chaotic, explosive graffiti. But the secret origin of his style, the reason his figures are filled with exposed skulls and skeletal diagrams, can be traced back to a single terrible afternoon in Brooklyn in 1968. At 7 years old, Basquiat was already obsessed with art. His favorite painting wasn't a cartoon or a landscape. It was Pablo Picasso's Guernica, a terrifying depiction of war and broken bodies. He would stare at it in the Museum of Modern Art, fascinated by the way the figures were deconstructed. Then, life decided to imitate art. While playing ball in the street, Basquiat was struck by a car. It was a brutal accident. He suffered a broken arm and severe internal injuries, forcing doctors to remove his spleen. He spent a month in Kings County Hospital, bedridden and bored. To keep him occupied, his mother bought him a gift. She didn't buy him a comic book or a toy. She bought him a dense medical textbook, Gray's Anatomy. Basquiat spent weeks memorizing the diagrams. He studied the muscles, the femurs, and the way the human skull sits under the skin. He didn't know it yet, but this book was programming his future genius. Years later, when he began to paint his masterpieces, the works that would be called the Black Guernica of his generation, he didn't just paint people. He painted their insides. He used the exact anatomical diagrams he learned in that hospital bed to deconstruct his subjects, just like Picasso. The worst day of his childhood, the day he was crushed by a car, was the exact reason he possessed the vocabulary to change art history. He took a medical manual meant to heal the body and used it to expose the soul. Sinking of the Gloucester. The HMS Gloucester was meant to be a royal party boat, ferrying the future King James II to Scotland in 1682. Instead, it became a container for one of the most terrifying what-if scenarios in history. When the ship slammed into a sandbank off the coast of Norfolk, it didn't just threaten a monarch, it nearly erased the architects of the modern world. James II was the prize passenger, and protocol dictated that no one could abandon ship until royalty was safe. But James dithered. He argued with the pilot and refused to leave, convinced the ship could be saved. As he wasted time, the water rose, trapping hundreds of men below deck. When the Duke finally boarded a lifeboat, he allowed only a select few to join him. This is where the coincidence becomes chilling. Standing on that sinking deck, waiting for permission to live, was John Churchill. He was a young courtier at the time, but his survival was essential for the 20th century. He was the ancestor of Winston Churchill. If he had drowned in the freezing North Sea, the British Prime Minister who fought fascism would never have been born. Alongside him was the Legge family. They were carrying cases of wine stamped with their maternal family crest, a design of stars and stripes. The Legges were cousins to the Washingtons of Virginia. The crest on those bottles, currently sitting at the bottom of the ocean, is the heraldic predecessor to the American flag. The Gloucester sank in under an hour, killing hundreds. But the single lifeboat that pulled away carried the future of the British monarchy, the genetic line of Winston Churchill, and the family symbols of George Washington. A single sandbank in 1682 nearly wiped out the figures who would define the Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, and the Second World War. Deus ex machina at Midway. The Pacific Ocean is 63 million square miles of water, a hiding place so vast that opposing navies can sail past each other without ever making contact. In June 1942, the outcome of the Second World War came down to a single ripple on that endless blue surface. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was leading a group of American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise. They were hunting the Japanese fleet, but the ocean was empty. The intelligence reports were wrong. McCluskey's planes were critically low on fuel. He had reached the absolute limit of his range and was facing a choice: turn back to the carrier or crash into the sea. He decided to push on for 5 more minutes. Looking down, he didn't see the enemy armada. He saw a tiny white streak cutting through the water. It was the wake of a solitary ship moving at high speed. That ship was the Japanese destroyer Arashi. It was not supposed to be there. Earlier that morning, a lone American submarine had tried to attack the Japanese formation. It failed, but the Arashi had stayed behind to hunt the sub down with depth charges. Having finished its hunt, the destroyer was now steaming full throttle to catch up with the main fleet. To McCluskey, that white wake was a giant arrow pointing the way. He turned his formation and followed the straggler. The destroyer led him directly to the Japanese carriers Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu. Even more miraculously, McCluskey arrived at the precise moment the Japanese fighter defenses were distracted by low-flying torpedo planes. The high skies were left unguarded. In the span of 5 minutes, the American bombers destroyed 3 aircraft carriers, shattering the Imperial Navy's power forever. The war was won because a single destroyer was late for a meeting. Safety glass. The invention that saves thousands of lives on the highway every year wasn't created by a safety engineer. It was created by a clumsy French chemist who didn't like doing the dishes. In 1903, Edouard Benedictus was working in his laboratory in Paris. While climbing a ladder to rearrange his shelves, he accidentally knocked a glass flask to the floor. He winced, waiting for the sound of shattering crystal and the inevitable cleanup of razor-sharp shards. The flask hit the hard floor with a loud crack, but it didn't explode. Benedictus climbed down and picked it up. To his amazement, the glass was broken into a spiderweb pattern, but the pieces were held firmly in place. The flask retained its original shape. He examined the label. The container had previously held a solution of cellulose nitrate, a liquid plastic. Over time, the liquid had evaporated, but Benedictus hadn't washed the flask. A thin, invisible film of dried plastic remained on the inside surface. When the glass broke, this sticky coating acted like a skin, gripping the fragments and preventing them from flying apart. Benedictus made a note of the oddity, but went back to work. A few days later, he was reading a newspaper article about a car accident in Paris. The driver had been badly injured, not by the impact, but by the windshield shattering into dagger-like pieces. At the time, cars used standard plate glass, which was deadly in a crash. The connection clicked. Benedictus ran back to his lab. He took 2 sheets of glass and sandwiched a layer of the cellulose nitrate between them, heating it to create a bond. He hit it with a hammer. The glass cracked, but the surface remained smooth and safe. He had accidentally invented the laminated windshield, proving that sometimes the most important safety features are discovered in the trash. The microwave oven. World War II was won with radar, but the technology that tracked enemy planes ended up revolutionizing the way we eat dinner. In 1945, Percy Spencer, a self-taught engineer at Raytheon, was inspecting a magnetron. This was a high-powered vacuum tube that generated the microwave radio signals used for defensive radar systems. Spencer was standing directly in front of the active device when he noticed a strange sensation. He wasn't hot, yet he realized that the peanut cluster bar tucked inside his pocket had suddenly turned into a sticky, gooey mess. Most people would have been concerned about the radiation or simply annoyed by the ruined trousers. Spencer, however, was scientifically curious. He suspected the invisible radio waves were agitating the molecules inside the food. To test his theory, he sent an assistant to buy a bag of popcorn kernels. He placed the corn in front of the tube, and within seconds, they popped and scattered across the laboratory floor, becoming the world's first microwave popcorn. He needed one final test to be sure. He placed a raw egg in the path of the beam. A skeptical colleague moved in for a closer look, just as the internal pressure caused the egg to explode, covering his face in hot yolk. Spencer realized the magnetron was generating intense internal heat by vibrating water molecules. He quickly built a metal box to trap this energy, creating a high-density electromagnetic field. Raytheon filed a patent for the radar range. The first models were the size of a refrigerator and cost more than a car, but the accidental physics held up. A snack melting in an engineer's pocket had successfully turned a weapon of war into the most convenient appliance in the modern kitchen. Discovery of phosphorus. In 1669, the path to scientific history didn't go through a university or a library. It went through a bathroom. Hennig Brand, a German merchant and amateur alchemist, was bankrupt and desperate. He was obsessed with finding the philosopher's stone, a legendary substance that could turn base metals into gold. Brand had a bizarre theory. He believed the key to creating gold was hidden within the human body. He reasoned that because urine was gold-colored, It must contain microscopic traces of the precious metal. He just needed to figure out how to extract it. Brand began a stomach-turning experiment. He collected 1,500 gallons of urine from his wife, friends, and the local army barracks. He took this massive, foul-smelling stockpile into his basement and boiled it down. He cooked the liquid until it turned into a thick, black syrup, and then he heated that syrup in a furnace at extreme temperatures. He expected to see gold nuggets form at the bottom of his retort. Instead, something terrifying happened. The glass container filled with a white vapor that condensed into a waxy, pale substance. It wasn't gold, but it was magical. The substance glowed in the dark with a ghostly green light. It didn't need heat to burn. It ignited simply by touching the air. Brand had unknowingly isolated pure white phosphorus. In his misguided quest to get rich using human waste, he became the first person in recorded history to discover a new element. He proved that the chemical building blocks of the universe were not just earth, air, fire, and water. He found the light bringer in the darkness of his basement, searching for the most valuable material on Earth by boiling the most worthless one. Vulcanized rubber. Before the mid-19th century, rubber was a joke. It was a miracle substance in the spring, but a disaster in the extremes. In the summer heat, waterproof coats melted into sticky sludge that smelled like rotting fish. In the winter cold, rubber boots froze and shattered like crystal. The industry had collapsed, leaving investors with piles of useless, rotting gum. Charles Goodyear was the only man who hadn't given up. He was a bankrupt hardware merchant obsessed with stabilizing the material. He treated his kitchen like a laboratory, mixing raw rubber with anything he could find. Salt, pepper, witch hazel, and even soup. For 5 years, he failed, dragging his family into poverty. In 1839, his luck changed because of a clumsy gesture. Goodyear was in a general store in Woburn, Massachusetts, showing off his latest experiment, a mixture of rubber and sulfur. In his excitement, the gum flew out of his hand and landed directly on the scorching hot potbelly stove. In the past, the heat would have turned the rubber into liquid goo. Goodyear prepared to scrape it off, but he noticed something strange. The material hadn't melted. It had charred, turning into a durable, leathery patch. He pressed a nail into it, and it bounced back. He put it outside in the freezing snow, and it stayed flexible. He had discovered vulcanization. By accidentally cooking the rubber, he forced the sulfur to bond with it, creating a material that was immune to the weather. That single mistake on a hot stove paved the way for the automobile tire, the engine gasket, and the modern industrial world. Goodyear died deep in debt, never knowing that the clumsy toss of a rubber ball would eventually carry the entire global economy. Superglue. In 1942, Dr. Harry Coover was not trying to fix a broken vase. He was trying to help Allied soldiers shoot straight. Working for Kodak during the height of World War II, his team was searching for a material to create crystal-clear plastic gun sights. They needed something durable, transparent, and easy to cast. Coover experimented with a family of chemicals called cyanoacrylates. The results were a disaster. The formula didn't form a nice, clean plastic shape. Instead, it was an annoying nuisance. It stuck to the mixing beaker. It stuck to the testing apparatus. It stuck to everything it touched with an unbreakable grip. Coover was frustrated. He viewed the extreme stickiness as a fatal flaw that ruined his expensive molds. He scrapped the formula and forgot about it. 9 years later, in 1951, Coover was working at a chemical plant in Tennessee. This time, he was trying to develop a heat-resistant coating for jet airplane canopies. He instructed an assistant, Fred Joyner, to test a list of old compounds, including that rejected failure from the war. Joyner spread the substance between two expensive glass prisms to check its optical properties. When he tried to separate them, they wouldn't move. The glass had fused together instantly. Panic set in. The equipment was worth a fortune, and they had just ruined it. But while the assistant worried about his job, Coover finally saw the truth. For nearly a decade, he had been throwing away the world's greatest adhesive because he was too focused on making plastic. He realized that this substance didn't need heat or pressure to work. It just needed moisture from the air to trigger a reaction. Coover rebranded the mistake as Eastman 910, later known as superglue. The product that holds the modern world together was only discovered because a chemist failed to make a gun sight twice. Viagra. In the early 1990s, a team of chemists at a Pfizer research facility in England was staring at a multi-million-dollar failure. They had spent years developing a new compound called sildenafil citrate. The goal was to treat angina, a condition that causes severe chest pain due to restricted blood flow to the heart. The theory was sound. The scientists believed the drug would relax the arterial walls, allowing blood to move more freely into the chest cavity. They launched a clinical trial with high hopes, administering the drug to miners and industrial workers in South Wales. The results were dismal. The medication had little to no effect on the patient's heart conditions. The chest pain remained, and the blood pressure readings barely moved. By all metrics, the project was a bust. The company prepared to cut its losses and shut the study down. As the trial concluded, the researchers began the standard procedure of collecting the unused pills from the volunteers. That is when the nurses noticed something bizarre. The men were refusing to give the medication back. The volunteers were embarrassed but insistent. They explained that while their chest pain hadn't improved, they were experiencing a very specific, powerful side effect. The drug was indeed relaxing blood vessels, just not in the heart. It was targeting the arteries in the lower body, causing significant and sustained erections. The scientists realized they were looking at the data upside down. They hadn't failed to cure heart disease. They had accidentally succeeded in curing erectile dysfunction. Pfizer immediately pivoted, rebranding the failed heart medication as Viagra. A drug destined for the incinerator became one of the best-selling pharmaceuticals in history, simply because the test subjects liked the side effects too much to return the leftovers. Velcro. Innovation is often pictured as a high-tech pursuit involving lasers and clean rooms. But the mechanism that holds astronaut suits together and keeps toddler shoes on tight was discovered because a Swiss engineer took a walk and got annoyed by weeds. In 1941, Georges de Mestral went for a hiking trip in the Alps with his Irish pointer. It was a lovely day until they returned to the trailhead. Both the man and the dog were covered in cockleburs. These prickly seed sacs had latched onto de Mestral's wool pants, and the dog's fur with maddening persistence. Most people would have just cursed the plants and spent the next hour picking them off. De Mestral did pick them off, but then he did something an engineer would do. He put one under a microscope. He expected to see some kind of sticky sap or glue. Instead, he saw geometry. The burr wasn't sticky at all. It was covered in thousands of tiny stiff hooks. His pants were made of fabric loops. When the two touched, the hooks caught the loops, creating a bond that was temporary but strong. It was a natural locking mechanism. De Mestral became obsessed with replicating this biological trick. He spent nearly a decade experimenting with cotton and other fibers. but they wore out too quickly. He eventually discovered that nylon, when treated with heat, formed stiff, durable hooks that wouldn't break. He named his invention Velcro, a combination of the French words for velvet and hook. It took years for the fashion industry to accept it, but once NASA used it to keep objects from floating away in zero gravity, the world followed. A walk in the woods turned a botanical nuisance into the most famous fastener on Earth. The 9/11 number 11. The Twin Towers were the defining feature of the Manhattan skyline, two silver monoliths standing side by side. Before they were a symbol of tragedy, they were a symbol of geometry. Visually, the buildings themselves formed a gigantic physical number 11. But on the day they fell, that specific number stopped being a shape and became a recurring mathematical phantom. The pattern begins with the geography. New York City contains exactly 11 letters. New York was also the 11th state admitted to the Union. The name of the building's target, the Pentagon, contains 11 letters. Even the nation from which the attacks were launched, Afghanistan, is an 11-letter word. The timeline deepens the connection. The attacks occurred on September 11th. Breaking that date down, 9 plus 1 equals 11. September 11th is the 254th day of the year. If you add 2 plus 5 plus 4, the sum is 11. After that day, there are exactly 111 days remaining in the calendar year. Then there are the machines involved. The first plane to strike the North Tower was American Airlines Flight 11. The crew and passenger count on that flight was 92. 9 plus 2 equals 11. The plane that struck the South Tower had 65 people on board. 6 plus 5 equals 11. Statisticians call this apophenia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns within random data. We look for order in chaos to help process trauma. Yet, the density of this specific number on this specific day remains one of history's most unsettling numerical anomalies, haunting the records of the event just as the towers once dominated the horizon. Falling on a grenade, the United States Marine Corps is built on strict discipline and absolute adherence to protocol. But on the black sands of Iwo Jima in 1945, a squad of Marines was saved from annihilation only because one soldier had broken every single rule in the book. Jacqueline Lucas wasn't supposed to be on Iwo Jima. In fact, he wasn't even supposed to be in the military. He was 14 years old. Lucas was a large kid who had forged his mother's signature to enlist. When the military stationed him in Hawaii to drive a truck, he got bored. He wanted to fight. So he went AWOL, stowed away on a transport ship, and bullied his way onto the front lines. By the time he reached the beach, he was technically a deserter. On February 20th, Lucas and 3 other Marines were creeping through a ravine when they were ambushed. 2 Japanese grenades landed directly in their trench. Standard protocol is to dive away. Lucas did the opposite. He yelled, "Grenades!" and hurled his body directly on top of them. He jammed one into the volcanic ash with his chest and pulled the other under his stomach, shielding his squad from the blast. Then came the miracle. One of the grenades was a complete dud. The other exploded, but the soft volcanic ash of the island absorbed much of the shockwave, and Lucas's body absorbed the shrapnel. He was launched into the air, riddled with metal, but he didn't die. He survived the war with over 200 pieces of iron inside him. He became the youngest Marine in history to receive the Medal of Honor. The coincidence is stark. If the military police had done their job and arrested the runaway teenager, or if Lucas had followed orders and stayed in Hawaii, the men in that trench would have died. They were saved by the only Marine who wasn't supposed to be there. The Superman curse. Superman is the most recognizable symbol of strength in American culture. He is the man of steel, impervious to bullets and bombs. But in the real world, the red cape seems to act less like a shield and more like a target. The Superman curse is a dark Hollywood legend suggesting that the role demands a terrible price from anyone who steps into it. The trouble began with the creators. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster invented the most profitable character in comic book history, yet they sold the rights for a grand total of $130. While Superman generated billions for corporate executives, the men who dreamed him up lived in near poverty, watching their creation conquer the world while they struggled to pay rent. Then came George Reeves, the face of the hero on 1950s television. He became a national icon, but the role trapped him. He couldn't get other work because audiences only saw him in tights. In 1959, amidst a stalling career and personal turmoil, he was found dead from a gunshot wound. The police ruled it a suicide, but the circumstances were suspicious enough that rumors of murder persist to this day. The man who deflected bullets on screen was destroyed by one in real life. The most tragic chapter involves Christopher Reeve. He defined the character for the modern era, embodying physical perfection and invulnerability. In 1995, a horse riding accident resulted in a catastrophic spinal injury. In a split second, the actor who convinced the world a man could fly was paralyzed from the neck down. Even the supporting cast hasn't been immune, with co-stars suffering from mental illness and severe accidents. The pattern creates a haunting irony. The character of Superman represents hope and invincibility. But the history of the franchise is a reminder of just how fragile human beings actually are. Cigarette that saved the world. The fate of the modern world wasn't decided by a brilliant general or a secret weapon. It was decided by a clumsy mistake involving a packet of tobacco. In September 1862, the United States was tearing itself apart. The Confederacy was on a winning streak, and General Robert E. Lee was marching his army into Maryland. His goal was to win a major victory on northern soil, which would likely convince Britain and France to officially recognize the South and intervene in the Civil War. If that happened, the United States would have broken permanently. But Lee's complex plan relied on secrecy. He drafted Special Order 191, detailing the exact movements of his divided army. Copies were written out for his commanders. One of those copies was given to General D.H. Hill. Hill received his orders, but in the chaos of moving camp, the piece of paper vanished. It hadn't been filed away or destroyed. It had been used to wrap 3 cigars, which were then accidentally dropped in a field near Frederick, Maryland. 2 days later, the Union Army moved into that same field. 2 enlisted men, Corporal Barton Mitchell and Sergeant John Bloss, were taking a break when they spotted the bundle in the grass. They didn't care about the paper, they were just excited to find free cigars. But when they unwrapped the tobacco, they realized the paper was a map to the entire enemy army. The intelligence reached General McClellan, who used it to intercept Lee at Antietam. It was the bloodiest day in American history, but it stopped the Southern invasion. Because of that victory, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, making the war about slavery and politically impossible for Europe to join the South. If those cigars hadn't fallen out of a pocket, the Confederacy likely would have won independence. There would have been no united superpower to fight in WWI or WW2. The geopolitical map of the 20th century was preserved because a Confederate officer was careless with his smoke break. Fog saved America. The United States exists today not because of a brilliant military maneuver, but because of a convenient change in the weather. In August 1776, the Declaration of Independence was barely a month old, and the American Revolution was already on the verge of total collapse. George Washington and his Continental Army were trapped on Brooklyn Heights. They had just lost the Battle of Long Island. The British Army had them surrounded on land, and the massive British fleet was waiting in the harbour. Washington was pinned against the East River with nowhere to go. The British plan was simple. They would sail their warships up the river, cut off Washington's retreat, and starve him out. The rebellion would have ended right there. But for days, a strong northeast wind blew directly into the faces of the British sailors, preventing the ships from moving upriver. Washington used this window to attempt a desperate evacuation. He ordered every small boat he could find to ferry his 9,000 men across the mile-wide river to Manhattan under the cover of darkness. The operation was slow. As the sun began to rise on the morning of August 30th, a large portion of the American army was still stuck on the Brooklyn shore. They were exposed. If the British saw them, the massacre would begin. That is when the miracle happened. A dense pea soup fog rolled in from the sea. It was so thick that men couldn't see 6 yards in front of them. The mist completely concealed the river and the American positions, effectively blinding the British sentries who were stationed just a few hundred yards away. Under this grey blanket, the Americans finished the evacuation in broad daylight. The last boat pushed off just as the fog lifted. When the British finally charged the American fortifications, they found nothing but empty trenches. The entire army had vanished into the mist, living to fight another day and eventually win the war. Universe. Imagine a soundboard in a recording studio covered in dozens of dials and sliders. Each knob controls a fundamental rule of reality. One dial sets the strength of gravity. Another determines the weight of an electron. A third controls how powerfully atoms stick together. Physicists call these the constants of nature. When scientists study these values, they discover something unsettling. The dials are not just set, they are balanced on a razor's edge. If you were to turn the gravity dial just a fraction of a percent to the right, the universe would have collapsed into a black hole shortly after the Big Bang. If you turned it a fraction to the left, the universe would have expanded so fast that stars and galaxies could never form. We would be floating in a dark, cold soup of thin gas. The coincidence gets tighter when you look at the energy inside an atom. If the force that binds the nucleus together was slightly weaker, hydrogen would never fuse into helium. Our sun would refuse to shine. If it was slightly stronger, all the hydrogen would have burned up in the first few minutes of creation, leaving no water and no fuel for life. This precision applies to almost everything. The ratio of the electron to the proton, the speed of light, and the density of space itself are all fine-tuned to an exact degree. It is like walking into a casino, playing a slot machine 1 billion times in a row, and hitting the jackpot on every single pull. We exist in a universe that seems rigged in our favor. Whether this is the result of a grand design or simply survivor bias in a multiverse of failures, the fact remains that we are living in the wildest statistical anomaly of all time.